People often think that, by 70, life's secrets are long settled. But I can tell you, that's not always true. Some secrets take root later, buried under a life that seems ordinary, until one moment unravels it all. I was the dutiful wife, the picture of loyalty and quiet respect, a woman who could slip by unnoticed and not miss a beat. I'd been Edgar's wife for nearly 25 years, tucked away in his world, settled in routines I no longer questioned. The lake house was his newest acquisition, and I assumed it would be our final, still retreat. But it turned out to be anything but still. Or final. It was a bright day in early summer when Callum arrived, filling our house with a different kind of quiet, one that had its own weight, its own charge. Edgar had never been one to talk about his past, about his first family, or the bitter divorce that had left Callum on one coast and Edgar on another. And Callum, all grown now at 27, carried that history with him in every look, in every pause between his words. I never thought of myself as one to give in to temptation. But something about the way he looked at me, lingering, questioning, made the room feel smaller, the air sharper. At first, it was the stories he shared late at night. Tales of his travels, of life far beyond the quiet shores of our lake. His voice was like water over stone, pulling me toward the edge. And by the time I realized how far I had gone, it was already too late. I think back to the nights we spent in secret, his voice filling the spaces Edgar had left empty. The thrill of each hidden encounter pulling me deeper into a world I couldn't escape. It was a foolish infatuation perhaps, but no more foolish than the silence that had filled our marriage for years. I told myself I could keep it hidden, that Edgar would never know, that the lake would swallow our secrets whole. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and as the days passed, I sensed that something else lurked beneath the surface of those waters, something dark and watchful, waiting to pull us under. Edgar began watching us both, his gaze heavy with suspicion, and I realized that Callum had brought more than just stories and laughter into our home. He carried shadows of his own, secrets he had carefully concealed, ones that would change everything. This isn't a story of love. Not quite. And it's not simply a tale of betrayal, though it might look like that from the outside. It's a story of desire and deception, of choices that pulled each of us into depths none of us understood. And now, sitting here, with nothing but the sound of the lake outside my window, I'm left with the pieces of what once was, the remnants of choices that can't be undone. The lake house felt like another world, one where time drifted lazily across the days, stretching long and silent. When Edgar inherited it from his uncle the year before, he'd called it a place to slow down, though his life had always been anything but slow. For years, Edgar's days were filled with meetings and decisions, his mind constantly occupied by business and plans. The lake house was supposed to be his retreat, the quiet punctuation to a life of relentless momentum, and I, like the dutiful wife, would slip into this new life beside him, as I had done for nearly 25 years. But with Edgar, quiet was rarely quiet. Even in his so-called retreat, he found ways to fill the silence, sorting through old documents, planning renovations, and keeping himself occupied with the legacy of his family's estate. I often felt like I was little more than a part of his well-kept surroundings, an addition to the furniture, an accessory he hardly noticed unless it was missing. Then came Callum. Edgar's first and only son had been a fleeting presence in our marriage, his name mentioned here and there, but never with any warmth. Callum was born during Edgar's first marriage, a union that ended in bitter divorce decades ago. Edgar had spoken of him as a child who had once idolized him, but who eventually slipped from his grasp, choosing a different path, rejecting the life Edgar had envisioned for him. To Edgar, Callum was a disappointment, a loose thread in the otherwise tidy fabric of his life. But when Callum appeared at the lake house that summer, he brought with him a quiet intensity that changed everything. I remember the day he arrived, stepping out of his car, pausing at the edge of the lake before finally walking up to the house. He looked around with a steady gaze, his expression unreadable, as if he were sizing up the place, or perhaps the life he might have had. He was tall, with a lean build that suggested both strength and restraint. His dark hair was unruly, a bit too long, and there was a hint of something unkempt in his appearance that made him look as if he'd come from somewhere wilder, rougher than the world Edgar had carefully constructed. His face was shadowed with stubble, his clothes worn and simple, a stark contrast to the polished look Edgar always maintained. The first time Callum looked at me, his gaze lingered just a moment too long. It was a quick, subtle glance, one that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But I felt it, a spark in the stillness, a question hanging in the air between us. And as he settled into the guest room at the end of the hall, I felt a new tension creep into the house, an unspoken energy that disrupted the placid routine Edgar and I had settled into. Over the next few days, Callum's presence became a strange fixture in our lives. He kept mostly to himself, drifting in and out of the house with a quiet confidence that seemed out of place here. He would disappear into the woods that surrounded the lake, sometimes for hours, returning with a faint smell of pine and earth lingering on him, his clothes dusted with leaves and bits of moss. Edgar, for his part, maintained a distant politeness toward Callum, though it was clear he was unsettled by his son's presence. Their conversations were brief, tense exchanges, filled with the kind of formality that hinted at something unsaid. Callum would ask him about the family business, the estate, but Edgar's answers were clipped, as though he didn't want to give Callum even a thread to hold on to. Sometimes, late at night, I would find Callum sitting alone by the lake, staring out over the water, his face illuminated by the moonlight. He looked so lost in those moments, his expression softened by some unspoken sadness that made my chest ache. I wanted to approach him, to ask him what weighed so heavily on him, but I held back, unsure of my place in his life, in this strange web of family that Edgar had kept hidden for so long. But there were moments when Callum and I would cross paths in the house, our eyes meeting, and in those fleeting exchanges, I felt a connection, something quiet, unspoken, that neither of us acknowledged aloud. It was a small thing, a subtle shift in the air, but it was enough to make me feel alive, to stir something in me that I hadn't felt in years. Edgar's relationship with Callum was strained, to say the least. There was a stiffness in his tone whenever he spoke to his son, a guardedness that hinted at old wounds and buried resentments. I tried, once or twice, to bridge the gap between them, to suggest a family outing or a shared meal, but Edgar quickly brushed off my efforts, dismissing them with a wave of his hand. "He's only here because he has nowhere else to go," Edgar muttered one evening, his voice laced with disdain. "I don't expect him to stay long." The words stung, not for Callum's sake, but for my own. Edgar's coldness toward his son mirrored the distance he had kept from me for years. A reminder of the life I had chosen. A life of quiet acquiescence, of standing at the edge of his world without ever being truly invited in. And yet, as the days passed, I found myself drawn to Callum, intrigued by his quiet solitude, his untamed nature. He was everything Edgar was not, wild, open, unguarded. There was a warmth in him, a depth that seemed to reach out to me, drawing me in despite the silent boundaries we kept between us. I began to look for him in the small moments, to listen for his footsteps in the hallway, to anticipate his presence, like a soft undercurrent beneath the still surface of my life. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out the attic, I came across an old photo of Callum as a boy, tucked away in a forgotten box. In the picture, he was no more than 7 or 8, his face filled with the kind of unguarded joy that only children possess. He was holding a small toy boat, his eyes bright, his smile wide, and I wondered what had happened to that boy. What had changed him into the quiet, that guarded man who now wandered through our house like a ghost of his former self? It was a week after Callum's arrival when he and I found ourselves alone by the lake. Edgar had gone into town to meet with an old business partner, and I was sitting on the porch watching the water ripple in the gentle breeze when Callum appeared beside me, a quiet presence that startled me out of my thoughts. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice soft, and I nodded, gesturing to the chair beside me. We sat in silence for a while, watching the light play on the water, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I could feel the warmth of his presence beside me, a steady, grounding energy that seemed to calm the restlessness that had plagued me since his arrival. "It's peaceful here," he murmured after a while, his gaze fixed on the lake. "I never thought I'd see it again." There was a sadness in his tone, a wistfulness that caught me off guard, and I found myself turning to him, compelled by a sudden urge to understand the man who had entered our lives so unexpectedly. "What happened, Callum?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Between you and your father?" He looked at me then, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark and intense. "It's complicated," he replied, his tone guarded. "He wanted me to be something I couldn't be. And I couldn't live up to his expectations." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken emotions, and I felt a pang of empathy for him, a sense of connection that went beyond words. I, too, had felt the weight of Edgar's expectations, the pressure to fit into the narrow mold he had carved out for me. And in that moment, I realized that Callum and I were more alike than I had thought, bound by the same silent struggle, the same yearning for something more. "It's never easy," I murmured, my gaze drifting back to the lake. "Living up to someone else's idea of who you should be." He nodded, his expression softening, and for a brief moment we were united in our shared understanding, our unspoken bond. It was a small thing, a fleeting connection, but it was enough to make me feel seen, to make me feel understood in a way that I hadn't felt in years. It was strange how quickly our quiet connection grew into something I could no longer ignore. The days passed in a slow rhythm, each one pulling me a little closer to him, making it harder to resist the pull of his presence. Edgar was often away or absorbed in his work, leaving Callum and me to drift through the hours, circling each other like two planets caught in an orbit we couldn't escape. At first, it was only the smallest of gestures, an accidental brush of our hands as we passed in the hallway, the soft exchange of a glance that lingered just a second too long. But with each passing day, those moments grew bolder, the space between us shrinking until it was nothing more than a breath, a whisper, a heartbeat. One evening after Edgar had gone to bed, I found myself in the living room, standing by the window and watching the moonlight dance across the lake. The silence was thick, almost heavy, pressing down on me, filling me with a sense of restlessness that I couldn't shake. And then I heard his footsteps, soft and tentative, as he entered the room and stood beside me, his presence like a warm shadow at my side. Neither of us spoke. We simply stood there, watching the water, our silence filled with 1,000 unspoken words. I felt his gaze on me, a quiet intensity that made my heart race, and I knew in that moment that we had crossed a line, that there was no going back. The first time he kissed me, it was like waking from a long, deep sleep. I hadn't realized how numb I'd become, how much of myself I'd tucked away over the years, until his touch brought it all rushing back. The thrill, the warmth, the feeling of being truly alive, it was intoxicating, and I found myself clinging to it, to him, as if he were the lifeline I hadn't known I needed. But with that thrill came guilt, a gnawing sense of betrayal that lingered at the edges of my mind, reminding me of the vows I had made, the promises I had broken. I told myself that it was only temporary, that it was a moment of weakness, a small indulgence in a life that had grown too quiet, too controlled. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. This wasn't just a passing infatuation. It was something deeper, something I couldn't simply walk away from. And so we fell into a rhythm, a careful, secret dance that filled the days with a sense of danger and excitement I hadn't felt in years. We stole moments in the early mornings, in the quiet corners of the house, our whispers blending with the sounds of the lake, our touches lingering just a little too long. We were careful, cautious, but there was a thrill in the secrecy, in the knowledge that we were tiptoeing along the edge of something forbidden. As the weeks passed, our relationship deepened, each stolen moment drawing us closer, binding us together in a way that felt as inevitable as the pull of the tide. We talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories from our pasts, dreams of places we would visit, lives we would live if things were different. I found myself captivated by him, by his warmth, his humor, his way of making even the smallest moments feel meaningful. But with each passing day, the weight of our secret grew heavier. I would lie awake at night, listening to the sound of Edgar's breathing, feeling the guilt settle over me like a shroud. I knew what I was doing was wrong, that I was risking everything for a love that could never last. But the thought of losing Callum, of returning to the quiet, empty life I had known before, was unbearable. One afternoon, as we walked along the edge of the lake, Callum took my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that felt both comforting and dangerous. We stopped beneath a large willow tree, its branches hanging low over the water, shielding us from view. He looked at me, his expression serious, a hint of something unreadable in his gaze. "We don't have to hide," he murmured, his voice soft but steady. "We could leave, Marlena. Start fresh somewhere else." The suggestion sent a thrill through me, a tantalizing glimpse of freedom, of a life unfettered by secrets and lies. But even as I allowed myself to imagine it, to picture a life with him beyond the lake, I knew it was impossible. I was bound to this life, to the choices I had made, and the thought of leaving it all behind felt as frightening as it did exhilarating. "I can't," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of the truth. I'm not brave enough." He nodded, a faint sadness in his eyes, but he didn't press me, didn't try to change my mind. Instead, he pulled me into his arms, holding me close, his touch a quiet reassurance that, for now, we had this moment, this fleeting escape from the world that waited just beyond the trees. The secrecy of our affair took on a life of its own, a constant undercurrent of danger and excitement that kept me on edge, my heart racing with every stolen glance, every whispered word. We were careful, yes, but there were close calls, moments when I would catch Edgar watching me, his gaze lingering, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes that made my stomach twist with dread. I became hyper-aware of everything, of the way Callum's hand would brush against mine as we passed each other in the hallway, of the way Edgar would glance at us, his expression thoughtful, calculating. Each day felt like a tightrope walk, a delicate balance between desire and fear, and I found myself teetering on the edge, caught between the life I had known and the one I couldn't let go of. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Edgar came into the kitchen, his gaze sharp, his movements tense. He watched me for a moment, his silence heavy, before finally speaking. "You've been distracted lately, Marlena," he said, his tone calm but laced with something darker, something that sent a chill down my spine. "Is there something you'd like to tell me?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I felt my heart stop, my mind racing as I searched for an answer, a way to deflect his suspicion. I forced a smile, keeping my voice steady as I replied, "No, Edgar. I'm just adjusting to the quiet out here. It takes time." He nodded, his expression unreadable, but I could sense the tension between us, the silent accusation that lingered in the air, a reminder that our secret was not as hidden as I had thought. That night, as Callum and I sat together on the porch, I told him about Edgar's question, about the sense of suspicion that seemed to be growing, thickening in the air around us. "He's starting to notice," I whispered, my voice barely audible, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of my chair. Callum reached for my hand, his grip firm, steady, a reassurance that I clung to in the darkness. "We'll be careful," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "We'll find a way to make this work, I promise." But even as he spoke the words, I could feel the walls closing in around us, the weight of our secret pressing down on me, suffocating me. I knew that our time was running out, that each moment we stole was borrowed, fleeting, a fragile illusion that would shatter the moment Edgar uncovered the truth. And as I looked at Callum, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the porch light, I realized that I was standing at a crossroads, caught between the life I had known and the one I longed for, and there was no escaping the consequences of the choice I was about to make. The days after Edgar's question were filled with a tension so thick it felt like I was breathing it in with every step I took. I would find him watching me from across the room, his gaze lingering a beat too long, his expression unreadable, as though he were trying to see beneath the surface, to peel back the layers I'd so carefully constructed. I'd known Edgar long enough to sense when he was suspicious, when he was beginning to piece something together. And that knowledge left me on edge, my nerves frayed, every glance from him setting my heart racing. Callum, meanwhile, seemed unfazed. If he noticed Edgar's suspicion, he didn't show it. He would come and go as he pleased, disappearing into the woods or down by the lake, his presence filling the house with a sense of freedom that both thrilled and terrified me. There was a recklessness about him, a defiance that made me feel both alive and vulnerable, as though I were teetering on the edge of something I couldn't control. But then, one morning, I stumbled upon something that changed everything. It was early, just after dawn, and I was alone in the house. Edgar had gone into town for supplies, and Callum was nowhere to be found. I decided to tidy up his room, to clear away the clutter that had started to accumulate, but as I lifted his duffel bag from the floor, a small envelope slipped out, fluttering to the ground. I hesitated, staring at the envelope, my heart pounding as I bent down to pick it up. It was a letter, the paper worn and creased, as though it had been read and reread many times. The name on the envelope wasn't Callum's, but the return address listed a bank in another state, far from the quiet shores of our lake. Something about it felt out of place, wrong even, as if it didn't belong in the same world Callum inhabited. Against my better judgment, I opened the envelope, unfolding the letter with trembling hands. The words inside were brief, direct, a summary of a financial transaction that sent a chill down my spine. A substantial withdrawal from an account I hadn't known existed. The amount was large enough to make me question everything, to wonder what Callum could possibly need such money for, or where it had come from in the first place. I read the letter again, my mind racing with possibilities, with doubts that had been simmering just beneath the surface, doubts I'd ignored in my desperate need to believe in him. Who was Callum, really? And what secrets had he been keeping from me? When I finally put the letter back, tucking it carefully into his bag, I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a gnawing sense of betrayal that left me shaken, uncertain. I had wanted to trust him, to believe that what we shared was real, but now the questions hung heavy in the air, casting shadows over the fragile world we had built. That evening, Edgar insisted that we have dinner together, a rare occurrence given his usual preference for solitude. He was in an uncharacteristically good mood, though there was an edge to his cheerfulness, a subtle tension that made me feel as though I were sitting on a knife's edge. Callum joined us reluctantly, his gaze guarded, his movements tense. I could see the flicker of annoyance in his eyes as Edgar spoke, a barely concealed resentment that hinted at old wounds, unresolved conflicts that simmered beneath the surface. "So Callum," Edgar said, his tone casual but with a hint of something darker. "What are your plans after this little visit? Back to the big city? Or perhaps you found a reason to stay?" Callum stiffened, his gaze narrowing as he looked at his father. "I haven't decided yet," he replied, his voice cold, detached. "Maybe I'll stay a while longer. The lake has a certain appeal." Edgar smiled, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "I see," he murmured, his gaze shifting briefly to me. A look that sent a chill down my spine, as though he were piecing together a puzzle I hadn't known he was working on. The rest of the meal passed in tense silence, each of us caught in our own thoughts, our own suspicions. I could feel Edgar's gaze on me, his questions lingering in the air, unspoken but heavy with implication. And as I looked at Callum, his expression unreadable, I felt a surge of doubt, a fear that I was caught in something I didn't fully understand, something that was unraveling faster than I could contain it. The days that followed were a blur of secrets and suspicion. Edgar's gaze grew sharper, his questions more pointed, and I could feel the walls closing in, the weight of our hidden affair pressing down on me, suffocating me. I spent every waking moment looking over my shoulder, fearing that Edgar would uncover the truth, that he would see through the lies and the half-truths I'd woven around him. One afternoon, unable to shake the sense of dread that had settled over me, I began searching Callum's room. I told myself it was only to ease my fears, to find something that would reassure me, that would prove that he wasn't hiding anything from me. But as I rummaged through his belongings, I found more than I had bargained for. Beneath a stack of old books, tucked away in a hidden pocket of his bag, was a file, a collection of documents that detailed a life I hadn't known Callum had led. There were arrest records, court documents, letters from creditors demanding payment. The words blurred before my eyes, each one a blow to the fragile trust I had placed in him, a reminder that I had been blind, foolish, in my desperation to believe in him. I put the file back, my hands trembling, my mind racing with questions, with doubts that left me hollow, empty. Who was Callum, really? And what had I become, allowing myself to be drawn into his world, to believe in a love that had been built on lies? That evening, as I sat alone on the porch, Callum joined me, his expression thoughtful, his gaze distant. He sat beside me, his silence a heavy presence that filled the space between us, and I knew in that moment that I couldn't keep my questions to myself any longer. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He looked at me, his gaze sharp, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Tell you what, Marlena." I took a deep breath, steeling myself as I met his gaze. "About the money, the debts, the trouble. I found the papers, Callum. I know you've been keeping things from me." He looked away, his expression hardening, and for a moment I thought he wouldn't answer, that he would simply leave, slipping back into the shadows where he had come from. But then he sighed, his shoulders slumping, as though the weight of his secrets had finally become too much to bear. "I didn't want you to know," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet resignation. I wanted to be someone else with you, someone who wasn't burdened by the past." The words sent a pang of sadness through me, a reminder of the man I had fallen for, the man I had believed in even as the truth unraveled around us. I wanted to reach out, to comfort him, to offer him the forgiveness he seemed to crave. But the doubts lingered, the questions that had been gnawing at me since I had found that letter, the nagging fear that I was little more than a pawn in a game I didn't understand. The following morning, Edgar confronted me. He was waiting for me in the kitchen, his gaze sharp, his expression colder than I had ever seen it. He didn't waste time with pleasantries or pretense. He simply looked at me, his silence a damning accusation that left me trembling, my heart racing with the knowledge that my carefully constructed world was crumbling before my eyes. "How long?" he asked, his voice low, barely more than a whisper. How long have you been seeing him? I opened my mouth to deny it, to lie. But the words caught in my throat, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me, suffocating me. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. And in that moment, I knew that the truth was written across my face, that there was no hiding from the consequences of the choices I had made. I thought I could trust you, Marlena, he murmured, his voice thick with betrayal, and I felt my heart shatter, the fragments scattering into 1,000 pieces, each one a reminder of the love I had betrayed. I wanted to apologize, to explain, to beg for his forgiveness, but I knew that it was too late, that the damage had been done. And as Edgar turned away, his silence a final condemnation, I realized that I had lost everything, that the life I had built was gone, torn apart by the choices I had made and the lies I had told. The morning after Edgar confronted me, the house was silent, each corner heavy with the weight of what had been revealed. Edgar moved through the rooms like a shadow, his gaze distant, his expression unreadable, and I felt the chill of his presence, the bitterness that had settled between us. I wanted to apologize, to explain, but the words felt hollow, meaningless in the face of the damage I had done. Callum, too, was different. He no longer moved through the house with the same careless ease. Instead, he stayed to himself, his footsteps soft, his face shadowed with an expression that I couldn't read. There was a tension in him, a quiet anger that simmered just beneath the surface, and I could feel it growing, like a storm gathering on the horizon. That evening, Edgar called us both into the living room. The sky outside was dark, a storm brewing over the lake, casting the room in a dim, eerie light. Edgar stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze steady, unyielding as he looked at us. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a sense of foreboding settling over me as I realized that this was it, the moment that would decide everything. "I think it's time we address the truth," Edgar said, his voice cold, detached. "No more lies, no more secrets. I want to know everything." I opened my mouth to speak, to offer some kind of explanation, but the words wouldn't come. I looked at Callum, hoping for some reassurance, but his expression was hard, his gaze distant, as though he, too, were caught in the weight of our choices. Edgar's gaze shifted to Callum, a flicker of anger darkening his eyes. "How long, Callum? How long have you been planning this?" Callum straightened, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Planning what exactly? I didn't plan to fall for Marlena. But maybe I did plan to see the look on your face when you realized you'd lost her." The words hit like a slap, and I felt my heart ache, a mixture of anger and regret twisting inside me. Callum's words were defiant, calculated, each one a reminder of the resentment he had carried, the bitterness that had brought him back to this house, to this moment. Edgar took a step forward, his fists clenched, his voice filled with barely restrained fury. "You think this is a game? You think you can just take what you want and walk away?" Callum held his ground, his gaze unwavering. "Isn't that what you've always done, Edgar? Taken whatever you wanted, left everyone else to pick up the pieces?" Their voices grew louder, each word a blow, each accusation a wound that had festered for years. And as I stood there, caught between them, I realized that I was nothing more than a pawn in their battle, a casualty of a war that had been waged long before I entered their lives. I stepped forward, my voice trembling as I tried to intervene. "Please stop this. This isn't about me. This is about both of you, about the resentment you've both carried for years. Can't you see what this is doing to us?" But my words fell on deaf ears. They were too caught up in their anger, too blinded by the wounds of the past to see anything beyond their own pain. Edgar lunged at Callum, his fists clenched, his face twisted in rage. They collided, each of them grappling for control, their bodies crashing into furniture, their grunts and shouts filling the room. I tried to intervene, to pull them apart, but they were locked in their struggle, each of them fueled by a lifetime of resentment, of anger that had been buried too long. I could see the hatred in their eyes, the need to destroy each other, to tear down the walls that had held them captive for so many years. And then, with a sickening thud, Edgar stumbled backward, his hand clutching his chest, his face pale, stricken. He gasped, his body crumpling to the floor, and in that moment I knew that something irreversible had happened, that we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I knelt beside Edgar, my hands trembling as I tried to revive him, but his eyes were unfocused, his breath shallow, fading. I looked up at Callum, his face stricken, as though he couldn't believe what had just happened. "Call an ambulance," I whispered, my voice thick with panic, but he didn't move, his gaze fixed on Edgar's still form, as though he were rooted to the spot. I didn't wait for him to respond. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed the number, my voice frantic as I gave them our address, begging them to come quickly, to save the man I had once loved, the man I had betrayed. But it was too late. Edgar's breathing slowed, his gaze unfocused, and I knew, even before the paramedics arrived, that he was gone, that our betrayal had cost him everything. As I sat there cradling his lifeless body, a wave of grief washed over me. A grief so deep, so all-consuming that it left me hollow, broken. I looked up at Callum, his face pale, stricken. And in that moment I knew that whatever we had shared was over, that we had destroyed each other in ways that could never be repaired. The police arrived, their questions a blur as they moved through the house, taking notes, asking questions, their voices muted, distant. Callum stood silently by the door, his face unreadable, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls, as though he were already gone, as though he had already left this place, this life, behind. When they finally left, when the house was quiet again, Callum turned to me, his expression a mixture of regret and resignation. "I never wanted this," he murmured, his voice barely audible, and I felt a pang of sadness, a reminder of the love we had shared, the love that had been twisted by lies and secrets, by the darkness that had always lingered just beneath the surface. "Neither did I," I whispered, my voice breaking, and for a moment we simply stood there, the silence between us filled with the weight of our choices, the knowledge that we had destroyed each other in ways that could never be undone. And then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door, leaving me alone in the house that had once been our sanctuary, our prison, the place where everything had begun and ended. As I watched him go, a quiet emptiness settled over me. A realization that I had lost everything, my love, my life, the dreams I had once held so close. I had gambled everything for a fleeting moment of passion, for a love that had been as fragile as the secrets we had kept. And now I was left with nothing but the silence, the shadows that lingered in the empty rooms, the memories of a life that had slipped through my fingers. It started with something so small, so seemingly inconsequential, that I still struggle to believe it unraveled everything. I was standing in the living room folding laundry when Jake called out from the hallway. "Lorraine, can you give me a hand with this?" I turned to see him standing by the stairs, his hands fumbling with the buckle of his belt. He was wearing a pair of khaki shorts that hung loosely on his hips, the leather strap of the belt twisted awkwardly. "Can you fix this? It's stuck or something?" he said, walking toward me. "Sure," I said, setting the folded towels aside. I stepped closer, reaching for the belt, and tried to untangle the strap from the buckle. "Hold still," I said, concentrating. "Yeah, sorry," he replied, holding his breath as I worked. But as I tugged at the leather, the buckle gave way, and before either of us could react, his shorts slipped down to his ankles. The world seemed to freeze. My eyes flickered downward, just for a second, a reflex I couldn't control, and I saw everything before quickly looking away. Jake stood frozen, his hands hovering awkwardly, his face turning red. Sorry, he muttered, quickly pulling his shorts back up. I stepped back, my cheeks burning as I stammered. It's fine. It happens. Yeah, he said, his voice strained. Thanks, for the help. He turned and hurried upstairs, leaving me standing there, my heart racing and my thoughts swirling. It was just an accident, a fleeting moment of awkwardness. But the charged air in the room, the way his eyes lingered on mine before he walked away, it changed something. Neither of us spoke about it, but from that moment on, things between us were never the same. My marriage to Alan wasn't what you'd call a love story. It wasn't bad either. Just a quiet, comfortable arrangement that had been losing its warmth for years. We married when I was 44, and he was 50. Both of us coming off failed first marriages. Alan was a man of routines and hobbies. Golf on Saturdays, fishing trips once a month, and an endless rotation of client dinners that kept him out late more often than not. I had come to accept the silences between us as part of the deal, filling my days with charity work, gardening, and keeping the house in order. But then Jake moved in. Alan's son from his first marriage had always been polite and distant with me. I'd only seen him a handful of times in the early years of my marriage, during the obligatory holiday visits when he was still in college. He was reserved back then, awkward in the way young men are when forced into rooms with new stepmothers. But now, 6 years later, the man who showed up at our doorstep wasn't the shy teenager I remembered. Jake had recently graduated and was struggling to find his footing in the world. His degree in fine arts, something Alan still rolled his eyes about, hadn't led to immediate success, and Alan offered him a place to stay while he figured things out. I wasn't consulted on the matter, but I didn't object. The house was big enough to accommodate him, and I didn't mind the idea of some company during the long days when Alan was at work or out with friends. What I didn't expect was how quickly Jake's presence would shift the energy of the house. He had an ease about him, the kind of natural charm that made people want to be around him. His humor was dry but disarming, his smile infectious, and his presence filled the empty spaces of the house in a way that Alan's never did. It started with small moments. One morning, I was trimming the hedges in the backyard when Jake wandered out with a cup of coffee, barefoot and tousled from sleep. He leaned against the patio door, watching me work with a lazy grin. "You're up early," I remarked, glancing at him. He shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee. "Couldn't sleep. Besides, someone has to admire all the work you're putting in out here." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "Don't let Alan hear you say that. He thinks this garden just takes care of itself." "Alan doesn't notice much," Jake replied, his tone casual but pointed. The comment caught me off guard, but I didn't press him on it. Instead, I kept trimming, acutely aware of his gaze lingering on me. Over the weeks, our conversations grew longer, and our interactions became a steady rhythm in the house. Jake would linger in the kitchen while I cooked, telling me stories about his college days or asking for advice about job applications. One afternoon, I found him sprawled on the couch in the living room, sketching in a notebook. "Mind if I take a look?" I asked, nodding toward the pad. He hesitated for a moment before handing it over. The pages were filled with intricate pencil sketches, portraits, landscapes, abstract designs that felt alive with movement. "These are incredible," I said honestly. "Thanks," he said, his voice quiet. "It's just something I do to pass the time." "You should show these to someone," I said. "A gallery or an art director. You have real talent, Jake." He smiled faintly, his eyes meeting mine. "You're the first person who's ever said that." The weight of his words hung between us, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Then came the belt incident, and everything changed. For days after, the air between us felt charged, heavy with an unspoken tension that neither of us knew how to address. I avoided being alone with him whenever possible, but it was a futile effort. The house was too quiet, too full of moments where we inevitably crossed paths. One evening, as I stood at the sink washing dishes, Jake came into the kitchen, his hair damp from a shower. "Lorraine," he said, his voice soft. I turned, my heart racing at the way he said my name. "Yes?" He hesitated, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. "About the other day, I'm sorry, that was awkward." "It's fine," I said quickly, turning back to the sink. "Let's just forget about it." "I don't think I can," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, the weight of his words sinking in. Slowly I turned to face him, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. "Jake, we can't," I started, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "I know. I don't want you to think it didn't mean anything to me." The intensity in his voice left me speechless, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then Alan's voice called out from the front door, breaking the spell. "I'll be right there," I said quickly, turning away from Jake. But even as I walked away, I knew something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and stolen glances. Alan, oblivious as ever, spent his evenings glued to the television or out with friends, leaving Jake and me to navigate the minefield we had created. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the guest room, Jake appeared in the doorway. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice tentative. I hesitated before nodding. "Close the door." He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. "I don't know how to act around you anymore," he admitted, his voice raw. "Jake, we have to let this go," I said, my voice trembling. "It was a moment, nothing more." "But it wasn't just a moment," he said, stepping closer. "At least, not for me." His words hung in the air, and for the first time, I let myself acknowledge the truth. It wasn't just a moment for me either. There's a moment when you know you're about to cross a line, and that once you do, there's no going back. I knew it the first time Jake kissed me. It wasn't planned, none of this ever was. It happened late one evening, after Alan had gone out to one of his golf buddies' poker nights. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, when Jake walked in. "Can't sleep?" I asked, glancing at him. "Something like that," he said, leaning against the doorway. He was barefoot, his hair messy, and there was a tension in his posture that made my chest tighten. We stood there in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. I could feel his eyes on me, and when I finally looked up, the intensity in his gaze left me breathless. "Lorraine," he said softly, taking a step closer. "Jake, don't," I whispered, even as my pulse quickened. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice low and steady. "You have to," I replied, my voice trembling. "This is wrong. You know that." "I know," he said, closing the distance between us. "But that doesn't change how I feel." And then he kissed me. It was tentative at first, as though he was waiting for me to push him away. But I didn't. I couldn't. When I finally pulled back, my heart was racing and I could barely meet his eyes. "This can't happen again," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe it. Neither did I. The days that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and quiet desperation. We tried to pretend nothing had changed, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every accidental touch felt electric, charged with the weight of everything we weren't saying. Alan remained blissfully unaware, his attention divided between work, his friends, and his endless hobbies. But even as he remained distracted, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were playing with fire. The second time it happened, it was in the garden. I had spent the morning pruning the roses, the warm sun beating down on my back, when Jake appeared behind me. "You're always out here," he said, his voice breaking the stillness. "It's peaceful," I replied, not turning around. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. "I think you like avoiding me." My breath caught, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. I turned to face him, my chest tightening as I met his gaze. There was no hesitation this time, no chance to talk myself out of it. He kissed me again, and this time, I kissed him back. What began as fleeting moments quickly spiraled into something neither of us could control. We were careful at first, finding quiet corners of the house where we wouldn't be disturbed. But the more time we spent together, the bolder we became. One evening, while Alan was out at a client dinner, Jake and I found ourselves in the library. I was pretending to organize the shelves, my hands trembling as he stood behind me. "You're shaking," he murmured, his breath warm against my neck. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice betrayed me. He placed his hands on my shoulders, turning me to face him. "You don't have to be afraid," he said softly. "I'm not afraid of you," I whispered. "I'm afraid of what we're doing." He cupped my face in his hands, his gaze steady. "Then stop thinking about it. Just be with me." I wanted to argue, to tell him we couldn't keep doing this, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I let him pull me into his arms, and for the first time in years, I felt alive. The secrecy of our relationship only added to its intensity. Every stolen moment felt like a rebellion against the life I had settled for, a reminder that there was still passion and desire buried beneath the routine of my marriage. But with the thrill came the fear. One afternoon, as Jake and I sat on the couch in the living room, Alan came home earlier than expected. "Lorraine?" he called out from the hallway. I jumped up, my heart racing as Jake quickly moved to the opposite side of the room. "In here," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. Alan walked in, glancing between us. "Didn't realize you'd have company," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes lingering on Jake. "Just catching up," Jake said smoothly, his posture relaxed. Alan nodded, but the look he gave me as he walked away sent a shiver down my spine. As careful as we were, it became harder to hide. Alan began asking questions. Subtle at first, but increasingly pointed. "You and Jake seem to be getting along well," he remarked one evening as we sat at the dinner table. "He's been a big help around the house," I replied, forcing a smile. Alan nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm glad to see that. It's good to know someone's keeping you company while I'm busy." His words were laced with something I couldn't quite place, and I felt the blood drain from my face. The first real crack came when Jake's best friend, Grant, showed up unannounced. Grant was loud, opinionated, and had a knack for picking up on things others tried to hide. "You've been spending a lot of time at home," Grant said to Jake one afternoon, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "Just helping out," Jake replied casually. "Must be nice," Grant said, his gaze flicking to me. "Having someone to keep you company." The comment sent a chill through me, and I quickly excused myself, leaving the two of them alone. Later, Jake found me in the kitchen, his expression tense. "Grant knows something," he said quietly. "He's guessing," I replied, though my voice wavered. Jake shook his head. "He's not stupid, Lorraine. He's going to figure it out." As the weeks went on, the tension in the house grew unbearable. Alan's suspicions, Grant's remarks, the weight of our secret. It all felt like a storm waiting to break. But even as the risks grew, so did my feelings for Jake. And no matter how dangerous it became, I couldn't bring myself to let him go. Keeping a secret is like holding your breath underwater. You can only do it for so long before the pressure starts to crush you. Jake and I were good at hiding, but the cracks in our facade were growing wider. Alan wasn't stupid, and neither was Grant. And then there was Heather, Alan's colleague, who managed to turn her casual visits into something more intrusive with each passing week. Heather arrived one Saturday afternoon, uninvited but perfectly at ease. She had been to the house a few times before, always under the pretense of dropping something off for Alan. This time, she came with a bottle of wine and a too bright smile. "I thought I'd stop by," she said as she walked into the kitchen where I was chopping vegetables. "Alan mentioned you've been feeling a little overwhelmed lately. I figured you could use a distraction." "I'm fine," I replied, forcing a smile, "but thank you." Heather placed the bottle on the counter and leaned against the island, her eyes scanning the room like she was cataloging every detail. "This place is gorgeous. You've done such a good job making it feel like a home." "Thank you," I said tightly. Her gaze lingered on the back door, where Jake had walked out only moments before. "Alan's lucky to have you, and Jake, of course. He's such a big help around here, isn't he?" My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my expression neutral. "He's been great. It's nice having him around." Heather's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I bet it is." As the weeks went on, Heather's presence became more frequent. She found excuses to drop by, always under the guise of work, but her real purpose was clear. She was fishing for something, though I couldn't tell if it was information or Alan himself. "You know," she said one afternoon as we sat in the living room, "Alan doesn't talk much about his personal life. But I get the sense that things haven't been perfect between you two." I stiffened, my hands gripping the teacup in my lap. "Every marriage has its challenges." "Of course," Heather said, her tone laced with false sympathy. "But I'm sure it helps having Jake around. He seems attentive." The implication in her words was unmistakable, and I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. Then there was Grant. Jake's best friend had always been blunt to the point of rudeness, but now his comments carried a sharper edge. "You've been spending a lot of time with Lorraine," Grant said one evening as he and Jake sat on the patio, beers in hand. Jake shrugged, keeping his tone casual. "She's my stepmom. Of course, we're going to talk." "Yeah, but it's not just that, is it?" Grant pressed, his gaze piercing. Jake's grip on his bottle tightened. "What are you trying to say?" "I'm saying you're acting weird," Grant replied. "And I don't think it's just because of the job stuff. There's something else going on, and I think it involves her." Jake stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone. "You don't know what you're talking about." Grant's eyes narrowed. "Don't I?" The tension in the house grew unbearable. Every interaction with Alan felt like walking a tightrope. Every visit from Heather like a test I was destined to fail. And Jake? Jake was becoming bolder, his frustration with our secrecy bubbling to the surface. One evening, as we sat in the library, he turned to me, his expression hard. "I can't keep doing this," he said. "Jake, we have to be careful," I replied, my voice trembling. "Careful isn't enough," he shot back. "Grant's suspicious, Heather's sniffing around, and Alan's not as clueless as you think." I looked away, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "What are you suggesting? That we stop?" He moved closer, his voice softening. "You know I can't do that, but we need to figure out what we're gonna do, because this isn't sustainable." The breaking point came during a dinner party Alan insisted on hosting. Heather was there, of course, along with a few of Alan's colleagues. Grant showed up too, his invitation courtesy of Jake. The evening started out innocently enough. Polite conversation, laughter, the clinking of wine glasses. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted. "So, Lorraine," Heather said, her voice cutting through the chatter, "how do you keep yourself occupied with Alan gone so often?" I froze, her question dripping with implication. "The usual things," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Gardening, reading, helping Jake with a few projects." Heather's smile sharpened. "You must be very close then." Across the table, Grant raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking to Jake. "Yeah, Jake's been spending a lot of time here lately. I guess it makes sense. Lorraine's pretty easy to talk to." The table fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Alan looked between us, his expression unreadable, while Heather sipped her wine, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. Jake pushed back his chair abruptly. "Excuse me," he muttered, leaving the room. "I think I'll check on him," I said quickly, standing up before anyone could stop me. I found Jake in the garden, pacing under the soft glow of the patio lights. "This was a mistake," he said as I approached. "What was?" I asked, my heart pounding. "All of it," he replied, his voice tight with frustration. "Letting Grant come here, pretending like everything's fine." "It's not fine, Lorraine. It's falling apart." I reached for him, my hand brushing his arm. "We'll figure it out." He turned to me, his eyes filled with desperation. "How?" "Because I'm running out of ways to keep this together." Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps on the gravel made us both freeze. I turned to see Alan standing at the edge of the garden, his face shadowed but his posture rigid. "What's going on out here?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Alan stood at the edge of the garden, his figure rigid in the soft glow of the patio lights. I could feel Jake tense beside me, and for a brief moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening, and my mind raced for something to say, anything to diffuse the tension that hung heavy in the air. "Alan," I said, forcing a smile, "we were just talking," he interrupted, his voice sharp. He took a step forward, his gaze flicking between me and Jake. "Funny how the two of you seem to have so much to talk about these days." Jake straightened, his jaw tightening. "Is there a problem?" Alan's lips curled into a cold smile. "I don't know, Jake. Should there be?" The weight of his words hit like a punch to the gut, and I felt my breath catch. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. He knew. "I think I'll head inside," Jake said, his voice steady but strained. "No," Alan snapped, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You'll stay right here." Jake hesitated, but he didn't move. Alan turned his attention to me, his eyes dark. "Care to explain why my wife and my son are sneaking around in the garden during a dinner party?" I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. The tension boiled over the next day. Alan was colder than ever, his clipped tone and icy stares making it clear that he wasn't letting this go. Jake tried to keep his distance, but it only made things worse. Heather, of course, found a way to insert herself into the chaos. I couldn't help but notice the awkwardness last night, she said as she sipped her coffee in the kitchen. It was just a misunderstanding, I replied, trying to keep my voice light. Heather tilted her head, her smile too sweet to be genuine. Of course. But, Lorraine, you might want to be careful. Perceptions can be dangerous, especially in a situation like this. Her words were a veiled threat, and I knew she was enjoying every second of it. The real twist came later that evening. Alan called me into the study, his demeanor calm but unnerving. I've been thinking, he said as he leaned back in his chair. Maybe it's time we made some changes. Changes? I asked cautiously. Jake's been here long enough, Alan said, his tone casual. I think it's time he moved on, found his own place. My heart sank. Alan, he's still figuring things out. And he can figure them out somewhere else, Alan interrupted, his gaze hard. This isn't up for debate, Lorraine. When I told Jake, his reaction was explosive. He's kicking me out? Jake said, his voice rising. Because of what? A conversation in the garden? He's suspicious, Jake, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He thinks what? Jake snapped. That something's going on? That's his problem, not ours. I placed a hand on his arm, trying to steady him. We knew this was a risk. We can't let this get worse. Jake shook his head, his jaw clenched. He's not doing this because he's suspicious. He's doing this because he wants to control you, and I'm not going to let him. The night Alan told Jake to leave was the beginning of the end. You have a week to pack your things, Alan said over dinner, his tone calm but firm. Jake's fork clattered against his plate as he stood abruptly. You don't get to decide when I leave. This is my house, Alan replied, his voice icy. And I won't tolerate this anymore. Tolerate what? Jake shot back, his voice rising. Me being here, or me getting closer to Lorraine than you ever could? The room fell silent, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Alan's expression darkened, and he stood, his voice low and dangerous. Get out of this house before I make you regret it. That night I found Jake in his room, his suitcase half-packed. You can't let him win, he said, his voice tight with anger. This isn't about winning, I replied, my voice trembling. This is about surviving. He turned to me, his eyes blazing. You don't have to stay here. You don't have to stay with him. I don't have a choice, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. There's always a choice, Jake said, stepping closer. Come with me. His words hung in the air, and for a moment I let myself imagine it, leaving everything behind, starting over somewhere far away. But the reality of what that would mean came crashing down, and I shook my head. I can't, I said, my voice breaking. Jake looked at me for a long moment before nodding. Then I'll go, he said quietly. But this isn't over. The next morning, Jake was gone. Alan didn't speak to me, and I spent the day wandering the empty house, haunted by the silence. But the real shock came that evening, when I found a note slipped under my bedroom door. You think you've won, Alan. But you don't know the truth. I'll make sure you do, Heather. My hands trembled as I read the note, the implications sinking in. Heather knew. She had seen something, overheard something, and now she was using it to her advantage. The note from Heather was like a ticking bomb in my hands. I stood frozen in my bedroom, reading the words over and over until they blurred together. My first instinct was to confront her, to demand to know what she thought she had on me. But the truth was, I already knew. She had seen or heard enough to piece together something dangerous, and now she held all the power. The confrontation came 2 days later. Heather invited herself over again, this time under the pretense of delivering some paperwork for Alan. I cornered her in the kitchen, my voice low and sharp as I held out the note. What is this? I demanded, my hands trembling. Heather didn't even flinch. She leaned against the counter, a faint smirk playing on her lips. Exactly what it says. Alan deserves to know the truth, don't you think? There's nothing to tell, I said quickly, though my voice wavered. Heather raised an eyebrow, her expression dripping with mock sympathy. Oh, Lorraine, you don't really believe that, do you? I've seen the way you and Jake look at each other. I'm not blind. My chest tightened, and I stepped closer, lowering my voice. If you think you can manipulate me with this, you're wrong. I won't let you destroy my family. Heather laughed softly, shaking her head. Destroy your family? Lorraine, you've already done that. I'm just expediting the inevitable. Before I could respond, the sound of Alan's voice carried down the hallway, and Heather's smile widened. "Don't worry," she whispered. "I'll handle the timing." That evening, Alan was quieter than usual, his mood tense as he picked at his dinner. Heather had left hours earlier, but her presence lingered like a shadow over the house. I couldn't tell if she had said anything to him, but the silence between us was suffocating. Finally, Alan set down his fork and looked at me. "Lorraine, is there something you want to tell me?" My heart stopped. I forced a smile, feigning confusion. "What do you mean?" Alan leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "You've been acting strange lately. And then there's Heather, dropping hints about things I don't understand. If there's something going on, now's the time to tell me." Panic bubbled in my chest, but I kept my composure. "Alan, there's nothing going on. Heather is just trying to stir up drama. You know how she is." Alan studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I hope you're right," he said, his tone heavy with warning. "Because if I find out otherwise—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities. Heather's threat loomed over me, and Alan's growing suspicion made every move feel like a step closer to disaster. And then, just as I was drifting off, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I grabbed it, my heart pounding as I read the message. "Meet me tomorrow, noon, the park by the bridge. Jake." The next day, I left the house under the pretense of running errands. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I drove to the park, my mind racing with what Jake could possibly want to say. When I arrived, he was waiting by the bridge, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "You shouldn't have contacted me," I said as I approached, my voice trembling. "I didn't have a choice," he replied, his eyes dark with frustration. "Heather came to see me." "What?" I breathed, the ground seeming to shift beneath me. "She knows, Lorraine," Jake said, his voice low and urgent. "She knows everything, and she's using it to get to Alan." My stomach churned. "What did she say to you?" "She wanted me to confess," he said bitterly. "To tell Alan the truth. She's playing both of us, Lorraine." I closed my eyes, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "We're running out of time," I whispered. Jake reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. "Then we have to act before she does."